The morning sun peeked through the windows of Denver International Airport as Captain James Rivera sipped his black coffee. He rubbed his tired eyes and checked his watch. 5:30 a.m. Another early morning, another flight. After 20 years of flying commercial jets, James had his routine down to a science. "Morning, Captain," said Lisa, his co-pilot for the day, as she settled into the chair beside him in the crew lounge. "Ready for Anchorage?" James nodded, finishing his coffee. "Weather looks clear all the way. Should be smooth sailing." He'd flown this route dozens of times, 6 hours from Denver to Anchorage, usually filled with tourists headed for Alaskan cruises or outdoor adventures. By 7:15, they had completed their pre-flight checks. James ran his hand over the controls of the Boeing 737 with the familiarity of an old friend. This plane, tail number and 478 UA, had been his regular aircraft for the past 3 months. He knew every sound it made, every slight vibration that was normal and every one that wasn't. At the gate, boarding began at 7:30 sharp. James stood near the cockpit door, greeting passengers with a smile as they filed past. It was something he'd started doing years ago, a small gesture that put nervous flyers at ease. Most passengers nodded politely or returned his smile before finding their seats. That's when he first noticed them, 5 men in matching leather jackets with a logo on the back, a skull with wings, and the words Sky Demons. The men were loud, laughing and pushing each other as they made their way down the aisle. The tallest one, with a thick beard streaked with gray, caught James's eye and gave him a strange look, almost like he recognized him. "Everything okay, sir?" James asked, maintaining his professional demeanor. The man just grunted and moved past. James caught the smell of alcohol, never a good sign at this hour. From the cockpit, James watched on the cabin monitor as the men spread across an entire row in the middle of the plane. The lead flight attendant, Diane, a veteran with 15 years of experience, approached him with a concerned look. "Those bikers are already causing trouble," she whispered. "They're demanding extra drinks before takeoff and making comments to female passengers." James sighed. "Let's keep an eye on them. If it gets worse, we'll address it." Diane nodded, but her worry was obvious. The big one. He calls himself Grizzly. He keeps asking questions about the pilot. Wanted to know who was flying today. That detail made James pause. Why would they care who was piloting the plane? He shrugged it off as the final passengers boarded. Probably just troublemakers who enjoyed making people uncomfortable. As the plane pushed back from the gate, James made his standard announcement, his deep voice calm and reassuring over the intercom. When he mentioned his name, "This is Captain Rivera," he noticed on the monitor that the biker called Grizzly nudged his companions and nodded. During takeoff, everything went smoothly. The plane climbed steadily through the morning sky, leaving the Rocky Mountains behind. Once they reached cruising altitude, James switched to autopilot and settled in for the long flight north. An hour passed without incident. Then, too, James began to think maybe he'd misjudged the situation. People often looked rougher than they actually were. Just as that thought crossed his mind, the cabin phone rang. It was Tommy, one of the younger flight attendants. "Captain, sorry to bother you, but those men in the leather jackets are getting rowdy. They've been drinking the me bottles they brought on board. We didn't catch them during boarding. They're starting to harass passengers nearby." "Have they touched anyone?" James asked, immediately alert. "Not yet, but they're getting louder. A few passengers have asked to be moved." "Keep me posted," James said. "If it escalates at all, let me know immediately." He hung up and shared the update with Lisa. Neither said what they were thinking. At 30,000 feet, there was nowhere to run if things got ugly. What James couldn't know was that these weren't just ordinary troublemakers. The Sky Demons had boarded his flight for a very specific reason, one that would soon turn this routine trip to Alaska into something nobody on board would ever forget. 3 hours into the flight, the sky outside was a deep blue as the plane cruised over the vast Canadian wilderness. Most passengers had settled into the comfortable silence of long-distance travel. Some watched movies on their screens, others napped with blankets pulled up to their chins, and a few read books or worked on laptops. The calm atmosphere was shattered by a burst of loud laughter from the middle of the cabin. The 5 bikers had been steadily drinking, passing small bottles between them that they'd somehow smuggled on board despite the flight attendant's vigilance. "Hey, turn that music up," shouted Grizzly, his voice carrying across several rows. A passenger in front of him, a middle-aged man in a business suit, turned around with a frown. "Some people are trying to sleep," the businessman said quietly. Grizzly leaned forward, his face uncomfortably close to the man's. "Did I ask for your opinion?" His breath reeked of whiskey. The businessman turned back around, his shoulders tense. Tommy, the young flight attendant, approached their row with a practiced smile. At 26, he was still relatively new to the job, but had dealt with his share of difficult passengers. "Gentlemen," he said, keeping his voice friendly but firm, "I need to ask you to keep your voices down. We've had several complaints." One of the bikers, a skinny guy with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, snickered. We've had several complaints," he mimicked in a high-pitched voice. Grizzly reached out and grabbed Tommy's sleeve. "We paid for these seats, same as everybody else. We'll talk as loud as we want." Tommy gently pulled his arm free. "Sir, I understand, but—" "You don't understand nothing," Grizzly cut him off. "Now how about you bring us some more drinks instead of lectures?" "I'm sorry, but I think you've had enough for now," Tommy replied, trying to maintain his composure. This brought hoots from the bikers. "He thinks we've had enough," laughed another man with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos. "Who made you the boss?" Diane, the lead flight attendant, noticed the confrontation and made her way down the aisle. At 45, she had handled countless difficult situations and knew when one was about to spiral out of control. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, standing beside Tommy. Grizzly looked her up and down with a smirk. "Well, hello there. Now you're more like it. How about you sit down and have a drink with us?" "Sir, I'm working," Diane said firmly. "And I need to remind you that interfering with flight crew duties is a federal offense." The mention of federal offenses seemed to amuse rather than concern the bikers. The one with the snake tattoo stood up suddenly, causing Diane to step back. "I gotta use the bathroom," he announced loudly, swaying slightly. "Don't give away my seat to any feds." He laughed at his own joke as he pushed past Diane, deliberately brushing against her. A young woman seated across the aisle, a college student returning home to Alaska, looked uncomfortable as the biker passed. When he noticed her watching, he stopped. "See something you like?" he asked with a leer. The student quickly looked away, but this only encouraged him. He stopped next to the seat. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart." A man seated next to the student, possibly her father, stood up. "Leave her alone and go about your business." The situation was quickly becoming volatile. The biker puffed up his chest, looking ready for a confrontation. Or what? In the cockpit, the phone buzzed urgently. Lisa picked it up, listened for a moment, then turned to James with alarm in her eyes. "We've got trouble," she said. "Diane says those bikers are harassing passengers and crew. One of them just got confrontational with a passenger who was defending his daughter." James took a deep breath, considering his options. The aircraft was over remote terrain, at least 2 hours from Anchorage and far from any diversion airport. "Tell Diane to try to defuse the situation," he said finally. "If she can't handle it, I'll—" Before he could finish, the cockpit door opened after a quick knock, and Diane slipped inside, her face flushed. "Captain, it's getting out of hand," she said quickly. The big one, Grizzly, just grabbed Mia's wrist when she tried to help a passenger. And now they're blocking the aisle. James exchanged a look with Lisa. This wasn't just unruly behavior anymore. This was a legitimate safety concern. "I need to handle this personally," he said, rising from his seat. "Are you sure that's wise?" Lisa asked, worry clear in her voice. James nodded grimly. "Stay at the controls. I'll be back as soon as I can." What he didn't tell her was that something about this situation felt wrong, almost planned. As he prepared to enter the cabin, James had no idea that his next actions would shock everyone on board, including the troublemakers who had severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. As James made his way to the cabin door, his mind flashed back to a very different time in his life. Most passengers saw him only as a friendly pilot in a crisp uniform, someone who made announcements about turbulence and weather. None of them knew about his past. It wasn't something he talked about much. 20 years earlier, before he'd ever flown a commercial jet, James had been Captain Rivera of the 8th Special Operations Squadron, an elite Air Force unit. He hadn't flown ordinary missions. His specialty had been extracting people from dangerous places, places where other aircraft couldn't or wouldn't go. He remembered one mission in particular, flying a small unmarked plane into a mountainous region where rebels had taken 3 American aid workers hostage. His team had 20 minutes on the ground. The landing strip was nothing more than a patch of dirt on a cliffside. One wrong move meant death for everyone. "You sure you can put her down on that?" his co-pilot had asked, eyeing the so-called runway. James had merely nodded, focused entirely on the task. They'd extracted all 3 hostages under heavy fire. No casualties, just another day at work. For 15 years, he'd lived that life. He'd flown through sandstorms in the Middle East, landed on improvised runways in the jungle, and navigated through anti-aircraft fire without radar. The Air Force hadn't just taught him to fly in impossible conditions, they'd trained him to handle impossible people. Every pilot in his unit went through intensive combat training. They learned how to defend themselves and others in confined spaces, how to control situations without excessive force, how to stay calm when everything around you was chaos. "You're not just pilots," his commander used to say. "You're the last line of defense if things go wrong." After retiring from the military, James had considered becoming a private pilot for wealthy clients. The money would have been better. But he chose commercial aviation instead, wanting to use his skills to keep ordinary people safe as they traveled to business meetings and family reunions. He kept in shape too. At 48, he still ran 5 miles every morning and practiced martial arts 3 times a week. His hobby puzzled some of his younger colleagues. "Why bother?" they'd ask. "We just sit in a cockpit all day." James would smile and say something about staying healthy, but the real reason was deeper. Old habits died hard, and preparation was second nature to him. Only last month, James had helped restrain a passenger having a psychiatric episode on a flight to Miami. The man had suddenly lunged at a flight attendant, screaming about the plane being hijacked. While other passengers froze, James had moved quickly, wrapping the man in a gentle but effective hold until he calmed down. Afterward, even the passenger thanked him for intervening without hurting him. "Where did you learn to do that?" the flight attendant had asked. James had shrugged. "Just picked it up along the way." Now, as he prepared to confront 5 drunk bikers, James felt that familiar focus returning. His heart rate remained steady. His breathing was even. Some pilots might have diverted to the nearest airport to let ground authorities handle the situation. Some might have tried to ignore it until they reached their destination. But James knew that at 30,000 feet, in a metal tube traveling at 500 miles per hour, problems rarely solve themselves. What made the situation even stranger was the way one of the bikers had recognized his name during the announcement. It wasn't random. These men hadn't just happened to be trouble, they were looking for trouble with him specifically. But why? James had made some enemies during his military days, but that was long ago. Most of those people were gone now, either dead or in prison. As he reached for the cockpit door, James glanced at the small photo tucked beside his instruments. It showed his late wife Karen holding their daughter Beth at her college graduation 2 years ago. Karen had died of cancer 6 months after that happy day. His family was the reason he'd left dangerous missions behind. The reason he'd chosen a safer life. Lisa, his co-pilot, watched him with concern. "Be careful out there," she said quietly. "I've already alerted the air marshals. They're in seats 14C and 27B. They'll back you up if needed." James nodded. "Keep her steady. I'll be back soon." He straightened his uniform jacket out of habit. In his military days, he'd worn a flight suit into danger zones. Today, his captain's uniform would have to do. Just before opening the door, James took one last deep breath. His old commander's voice echoed in his head. "When things go wrong at 30,000 feet, there's no backup coming. You are the backup." With that thought, he unlocked the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin, unaware that videos of what was about to happen would soon be seen by millions of people around the world. The moment James stepped into the cabin, he felt the tension in the air. Passengers sat stiffly in their seats, eyes darting between their laps and the commotion in the middle of the plane. The 5 bikers had created their own little kingdom in rows 16 and 17, with Grizzly holding court like some kind of leather-clad king. James walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps steady and deliberate. A hush fell over the cabin as passengers noticed him. It wasn't often they saw a pilot leave the cockpit mid-flight. Diane stood near the bikers, her professional smile strained. Relief washed over her face when she spotted James. The young flight attendant, Mia, was rubbing her wrist where Grizzly had grabbed her. "Everything all right here?" James asked, his voice calm but carrying enough authority to silence the bikers momentarily. Grizzly looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he recognized the captain. A strange smile spread across his face. "Well, look who it is, the big man himself." "I understand there's been some disruptive behavior," James said, addressing the group. "I need you gentlemen to return to your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and keep the noise down." The biker with the snake tattoo snorted. "Or what? You gonna throw us off the plane?" His friends laughed as if this was the funniest joke they'd ever heard. A woman in the row behind them clutched her young son closer. The boy, about 7 years old, watched wide-eyed as the grown-ups argued. James noticed this and felt a renewed sense of responsibility. It wasn't just about handling troublemakers, it was about making sure this child and everyone else on the plane felt safe. "Sir, as the captain of this aircraft, I have both the responsibility and the authority to ensure the safety of everyone on board," James explained patiently. "If you can't comply with crew instructions, there will be consequences when we land." Grizzly stood up then, towering over James by at least 4 inches. At 6'4", with shoulders like a linebacker, he obviously expected his size to be intimidating. He stepped into the aisle, forcing James to either back up or stand his ground. James didn't move an inch. "You don't recognize me, do you, Captain Rivera?" Grizzly asked, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. James studied the man's face. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but he couldn't place it. "Should I?" Grizzly leaned in closer. "Afghanistan, 2008. You and your special ops buddies dropped in and extracted a bunch of government contractors. His breath was hot with alcohol. My brother was left behind. Remember that?" Suddenly, it clicked. There had been a security contractor named Wilson who'd gone missing during an operation. Intelligence had reported him killed by insurgents days before the extraction. His body was never recovered. "Wilson was your brother?" James asked quietly. "Give the man a prize," Grizzly sneered. "My brother Pete radioed for extraction, but you guys never came for him. Left him to die out there." The other bikers were watching intently now. This wasn't random harassment. This was personal. "We were told he was already dead," James said evenly. "If we'd known." "Save it," Grizzly cut him off. "I've been waiting 15 years to find you, Rivera. When I saw your name on the flight manifest, I knew it was fate." The businessman who had tried to intervene earlier looked concerned. "Captain, do you need assistance?" he asked, half rising from his seat. "Stay out of this," Grizzly barked, then turned back to James. "You and me, we're gonna have a little chat after this flight lands. My boys and I thought we'd give you a taste of what's coming by making your job difficult today." James kept his voice low and controlled. "Mr. Wilson, I understand your grief, but this isn't the way to handle it. There are 143 innocent people on this plane who have nothing to do with what happened to your brother." "Don't you dare talk about my brother," Grizzly snarled, his face reddening. "You don't get to say his name." Throughout the exchange, James had been subtly positioning himself. He'd moved slightly to his left, keeping his right side angled away from Grizzly. His feet were now shoulder-width apart, his weight balanced. It was a stance most people wouldn't notice, but anyone with combat training would recognize it immediately. "I'm going to ask you one more time to return to your seat," James said firmly. "Or what?" Grizzly challenged. James noticed one of the air marshals slowly making his way down the aisle from the front of the plane. Another was approaching from the rear. They weren't close enough to help if things escalated quickly. "Don't make this worse than it already is," James warned. That's when Grizzly made his mistake. Frustration and alcohol overriding judgment, he reached out and poked James hard in the chest with a thick finger. "What are you going to do about it, flyboy?" The cabin went completely silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade away as everyone watched to see what would happen next. The little boy behind them whispered, "Mom, is the pilot going to be okay?" His mother didn't have time to answer before Grizzly, emboldened by James's lack of immediate reaction, reached out again, this time to grab the pilot's uniform. What happened in the next 3 seconds would soon be replayed on news channels around the world, analyzed by self-defense experts, and viewed millions of times online. But for the passengers on Flight 257, watching it unfold in real time, it was nothing short of astonishing. In the split second before Grizzly's hand closed on his uniform, James made his decision. He wasn't going to let this escalate further. Too many lives were at stake. When Grizzly's meaty fingers reached for his collar, James moved with the fluid precision of someone who had practiced these movements thousands of times. He stepped slightly to the side and redirected Grizzly's grabbing arm with a gentle but firm touch to the wrist, turning the bigger man's momentum against him. Before anyone fully registered what was happening, Grizzly found himself off balance, his arm extended in a position that gave him no leverage. James applied the slightest pressure to a specific point on the man's wrist and forearm. To the watching passengers, it barely looked like James was touching him at all. Yet somehow, Grizzly's face twisted in sudden discomfort as he instinctively bent forward to relieve the pressure. "What the?" Grizzly gasped, unable to pull away without causing himself more pain. The other bikers half rose from their seats, but James's voice cut through their confusion like a knife. "Stay exactly where you are," he commanded. There was something in his tone, a quiet authority that brooked no argument, that made them hesitate. The snake-tattooed biker looked uncertain. "Boss." Grizzly was now bent over at an awkward angle, his face reddening, partly from embarrassment, partly from the discomfort of the hold. James had him positioned in such a way that any movement on Grizzly's part would only increase his own discomfort. "This doesn't have to get worse," James said calmly, as though they were discussing the weather. "I understand you're angry about your brother. I truly do. But there are better ways to handle this." "Let go of me," Grizzly hissed through clenched teeth. "Once I know everyone on this plane is safe," James replied. His voice remained even, professional. Nothing in his demeanor suggested fear or anger, just absolute control of the situation. By now, the 2 air marshals had reached the scene. They pulled out their badges, revealing themselves to the startled passengers nearby. "Federal Air Marshals," announced the older one, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair. "Everyone stay calm." A murmur ran through the cabin as passengers realized that plainclothes security had been among them all along. A few pulled out their phones and began recording the scene, despite the flight attendant's requests to stop. The second air marshal, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, addressed the bikers. "Gentlemen, I need all of you to put your hands on the seats in front of you where I can see them." The bikers looked to Grizzly for guidance, but he was in no position to give orders. After a moment of tense silence, they complied, placing their hands on the backs of the seats ahead of them. Only when they had done so did James slowly release his hold on Grizzly. The big man straightened up, rubbing his wrist with a mixture of pain and shock on his face. "That was a pressure hold, not a pain compliance technique," James explained quietly, so only Grizzly could hear. "I didn't want to hurt you." Grizzly stared at him, bewilderment replacing some of the anger in his eyes. "How did you? You're just a pilot." "I'm the pilot responsible for every life on this aircraft," James corrected him, "including yours." The first air marshal stepped between them. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat now," he told Grizzly firmly. For a moment, it seemed like Grizzly might resist. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. But something in James's steady gaze, perhaps the recognition that he was dealing with someone far more capable than he had anticipated, made him reconsider. "This isn't over, Rivera," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow now. "For today, it is," James replied. As Grizzly grudgingly returned to his seat, the female air marshal leaned close to James. "Nice move, Captain. Where'd you learn that?" "Air Force," James said simply. "Special Operations." She nodded with newfound respect. "Figured it was something like that. We'll take it from here." The older air marshal positioned himself in the aisle beside the bikers' row. "Gentlemen, for the remainder of this flight, you will not leave your seats except to use the lavatory, one at a time with my escort. Any further disruption and you will be restrained. Is that clear? The bikers mumbled their agreement, subdued by the unexpected turn of events. The fight had gone out of them, at least for now. James turned to address the other passengers, many of whom were watching wide-eyed or whispering to each other. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance. The situation is under control, and we'll be continuing to Anchorage as planned. Please try to relax and enjoy the rest of your flight. A spontaneous burst of applause erupted from several passengers. The businessman who had tried to help earlier gave James a thumbs up. The mother with the young son mouthed a silent thank you as her child looked at the pilot with undisguised admiration. As James made his way back toward the cockpit, Diane fell into step beside him. "That was incredible," she said quietly. "I've never seen anything like it." "Just did what needed to be done," James replied. But inside, his mind was already calculating. The situation was contained for now, but having 5 angry bikers and a personal vendetta waiting in Anchorage presented a whole new set of problems. Perhaps continuing to their original destination wasn't the wisest choice after all. Reaching the cockpit door, James made a decision. It was time to change the plan. Back in the cockpit, James settled into his seat with a deep breath. Lisa looked at him with wide eyes. "You okay?" she asked, scanning him for any signs of injury. "Diane radioed me what happened. Said you took down that big guy like you were some kind of ninja." James shook his head. "Just basic training, nothing dramatic." He reached for his headset and put it on, already thinking through his next move. Basic training? That didn't sound basic from what Diane described. Lisa watched him curiously. She said the air marshals are keeping an eye on them now. "They are," James confirmed, "but we've still got a problem." He pulled up the navigation display and studied it. "Those men came on this flight specifically looking for me. If we land in Anchorage as scheduled, they'll have friends waiting. I'm not worried about myself, but I don't want any of our passengers caught in the middle of something ugly at the terminal." Lisa nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her face. "You're thinking of diverting." "I am." James tapped the screen, highlighting a point on their route. "Seattle. We've got enough fuel, and it gives us a major airport with plenty of security." "That's a serious decision," Lisa said. "The company will ask questions." James nodded. "I'll handle it. Safety comes first, always has." He picked up the radio and contacted air traffic control. "Seattle Center, this is Flight 257. We need to request a diversion to Seattle-Tacoma International due to an onboard security situation that has been contained but requires law enforcement assistance upon landing." The controller's voice came back promptly. "Flight 257, we copy your request for diversion. Stand by while we coordinate." While they waited, James turned to Lisa. "Once we get clearance, I want you to make an announcement. Keep it simple. Tell them we're diverting due to a security situation that's under control. No need to cause panic." Lisa nodded. "What about fuel?" "We've got plenty," James assured her. "We fueled up for Anchorage, which is another 2 hours beyond Seattle. We're good." The radio crackled again. "Flight 257, Seattle Center. Your diversion is approved. Descend to flight level 340. Expect vectors for approach to SeaTac in approximately 45 minutes. Seattle Center, Flight 257, descending to flight level 340, James confirmed, already adjusting their heading. The plane banked gently to the right as they began their new course. Lisa picked up the intercom and made the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Lisa Chen. Due to a security situation that is now under control, Captain Rivera has decided to divert to Seattle. Our new arrival time will be approximately 45 minutes from now. There is no immediate concern, and we ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your cooperation." A buzz of conversation immediately filled the cabin as passengers reacted to the news. James could imagine the scene, people checking their watches, texting family members about the change, maybe shooting nervous glances toward the bikers' row where the air marshals stood guard. "Should we alert Seattle police about what to expect?" Lisa asked. James nodded. "Already on it." He typed a message into the aircraft's communication system, detailing the situation and requesting police presence at the gate upon arrival. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere remained tense but controlled. The air marshals kept watchful eyes on the bikers, who sat in sullen silence. Passengers whispered to each other, some casting curious glances at the cockpit door, no doubt wondering about the pilot who had shown such unexpected skills. Diane approached the cockpit and knocked. When Lisa let her in, she addressed James directly. "Captain, passengers are asking questions. What should we tell them?" "Just the basics," James replied. "Security concern. Everything's under control. We're diverting as a precaution." Diane nodded. "Also, I thought you should know, people were recording with their phones when you handled the situation. I tried to get them to stop, but..." She shrugged helplessly. James sighed. "It is what it is. We'll deal with that later." As Diane left, Lisa turned to him. "You're going to be famous, you know. Those videos will be all over the internet by tonight." James groaned. "That's the last thing I want." He'd spent his entire career, both military and civilian, staying out of the spotlight. Now, because of 5 angry bikers, he might become an unwilling internet sensation. 40 minutes later, the towers of Seattle came into view through breaks in the cloud cover. James began their descent, his hands steady on the controls. Below them, a small army of police vehicles was gathering near their assigned gate. The airline's ground staff had clearly taken their security message seriously. "Seattle approach, Flight 257, descending through 10,000 feet, James reported. "Flight 257, Seattle approach. You are cleared for the ILS approach to runway 16R, wind 170 at 8 knots. Police and security personnel are standing by at gate A7. "Roger that, cleared for ILS approach runway 16R, James confirmed. The landing was smooth despite the crosswind, a testament to James's skill. As they taxied toward the gate, blue lights flashed outside the windows. At least a dozen police officers were visible on the tarmac. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rivera," James announced over the intercom. "We have arrived safely in Seattle. Local authorities will be boarding the aircraft momentarily. When they do, I ask that everyone remain seated until instructed otherwise. Thank you for your patience and cooperation during this unexpected situation." As he finished speaking, James caught sight of a police sergeant waiting at the jet bridge, flanked by uniformed officers. This was going to be complicated. There would be statements to give, reports to file, and questions to answer. The airline would want an explanation. The passengers would have stories to tell. And somewhere in all of it, 5 bikers would face federal charges for interfering with a flight crew, a serious offense that carried hefty fines and potential prison time. James powered down the aircraft systems with practiced efficiency. Whatever happened next, he had done his job. Every passenger on his plane was safe. In the end, that was all that really mattered to him. By the next morning, James couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. The videos had spread like wildfire across social media, shared millions of times with headlines like "Pilot Ninja takes down biker gang" and "Captain Cool, the flying kung fu master." His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications as old friends, former military colleagues, and even his daughter's college roommates sent him links to the videos. "Dad, you're trending." Beth had called to tell him, equal parts amused and amazed. "There are memes about you." James sat in his hotel room in Seattle, sipping coffee and shaking his head at the laptop screen. The airline had put him up for the night after the lengthy interviews with police and airline security. The 5 bikers were in custody, facing federal charges that could land them in prison for years. Grizzly, whose real name turned out to be Frank Wilson, was looking at additional charges for making threats. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. James opened it to find a young man in a suit holding a folder. "Captain Rivera? I'm Taylor from Public Relations. The company sent me to brief you before your press conference." "My what?" James frowned. Taylor looked surprised. "Didn't anyone tell you?" "There's a press conference scheduled for 11 a.m. The CEO will be there too. Your actions saved the company millions in potential lawsuits, not to mention protecting our passengers." James checked his watch. 9:30 a.m. "I'm not much for public speaking," he said. "Just be yourself," Taylor advised. "That's what people are connecting with, a real hero who didn't make a big deal about it." "I'm no hero," James said automatically. "I was just doing my job." Taylor smiled. "And that's exactly what you should say at the press conference." 2 hours later, James stood uncomfortably at a podium, cameras flashing in his face as reporters shouted questions. The airline's CEO stood beside him, beaming with pride as if he personally trained James himself. "Captain Rivera," called a reporter in the front row, "the video shows you took down a man twice your size without hurting him. Where did you learn those skills?" James cleared his throat. "Air Force training, ma'am. I spent 15 years in special operations before joining commercial aviation." "Is it true the bikers were targeting you specifically?" asked another reporter. James chose his words carefully. "The individual in question had a personal grievance related to my military service. It was a misunderstanding." He didn't elaborate further. Despite everything, he felt some sympathy for Frank Wilson, a man who had spent years grieving his brother and blaming the wrong people. After the press conference, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The airline gave James 2 weeks of paid leave, which he hadn't asked for but gratefully accepted. He spent it fishing at his favorite lake, where cell service was spotty at best. When he returned to work, passengers sometimes recognized him. Some asked for selfies. Flight attendants joked about feeling extra safe on his flights. James handled it all with the same quiet professionalism he'd always shown. 6 months passed. The media frenzy died down. The bikers pleaded guilty to reduced charges, with Frank Wilson receiving the longest sentence, 3 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. James received a handwritten letter from prison. It was short. "Rivera, I was wrong about what happened to my brother. Found out the truth. Sorry for the trouble. Frank." He didn't respond but kept the letter. What did change, however, was the airline industry itself. James was asked to help develop new training protocols for pilots and flight attendants, teaching them basic de-escalation techniques and safe restraint methods. Other airlines soon adopted similar programs. The FAA even updated some of its security recommendations based on the incident. On a cool autumn day, James found himself back at Denver International Airport, walking through the main terminal toward his gate. He was deadheading to Chicago, riding as a passenger to position for his next flight. As he waited in line at the coffee shop, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find an older couple smiling at him. The woman spoke first. "Excuse me, you probably don't remember us, but we were on that flight." "The one with the bikers." James smiled politely. "I hope the rest of your trip went better." The man nodded. "It did. We just wanted to say thank you. Our grandson was with us, the little boy who was watching everything. He's decided he wants to be a pilot now." "That's wonderful," James said sincerely. "We were so scared," the woman continued. "But the way you handled it, you were so calm. You made us feel safe again." James thanked them, oddly touched by the encounter. As they walked away, he realized something important. Throughout his military career, he'd never really known the impact of his actions. Missions were classified, people were extracted or rescued, and he flew away, never to see them again. But now, in this new chapter of his life, he could see the difference he made. In the grateful smiles of passengers. In the industry changes that would make flying safer for everyone. In a young boy who'd found a new dream. He paid for his coffee and continued toward his gate, just another pilot in uniform rolling his flight bag behind him. Most people he passed had no idea who he was, and that was fine with him. James had never needed recognition to know his own worth. As he settled into his passenger seat by the window, he watched the ground crew prepare the aircraft for departure. Another day, another flight. The sky stretched endlessly blue above the mountains. James smiled to himself as the engines rumbled to life. Despite everything, there was still nowhere he'd rather be than here, soaring above the clouds, making sure people got safely to where they needed to go. Some heroes wore capes, he supposed. He was perfectly content with his wings.